The day begins without a true beginning, slipping out of the grey half-light that hovers over the market town, while the cobblestones are still damp from the night's quiet breath. You walk a dirt path that leads away from the last cottages, past a tangle of elder bushes and a leaning wooden gate that no one ever closes. The path is narrow and packed down by years of your own footsteps, the soles of your boots, knowing every dip and turn without the need for your eyes. The air this early holds a coolness that seems not cold, but simply empty. A stillness that has not yet remembered how to move. It carries the faintest hint of something that is not quite a smell yet, more a presence, the memory of yesterday's work waiting in the shed ahead. The shed itself appears slowly as the light strengthens from charcoal to pearl. It is a low, rectangular building of dark weatherboard, its roof sloping in a single, tired angle toward a hedge of hawthorn that marks the edge of the field. No smoke rises from the squat chimney yet. The door, heavy and unpainted, stands closed but not locked, its iron latch resting in a groove worn smooth by the motion of a hand lifting it each morning. Around the shed, the ground is bare earth, swept clean, with a few scattered wood chips and the pale arc of an old ash pile near the corner. Nothing stirs, nothing calls. The shed simply waits, holding in the dark what you left there the evening before. You pause for a moment at the door, not from hesitation, but from a habit older than memory. Your hand rests on the rough grain of the wood, feeling the slight give of the boards against the frame. Then you lift the latch, and the door swings inward without a sound because you oiled the hinges last month with a drop of the tallow that rises to the top of the cooling vat. The interior breathes out a lungful of air that is warmer than the dawn and thick with the scent of boiled bone, old hide, and the faint mineral tang of copper. It is not an unpleasant smell, just a heavy one, a smell that seems to have weight and texture, settling on your skin like a second layer of clothing. Inside, the largest shape is the vat. It sits on its bed of brick like a sleeping animal, a great copper cauldron wider than your outstretched arms and deeper than your waist. Its rim catches the grey light that seeps through the gaps in the shutters, a dull gleam that has been polished by years of liquid and steam rather than any cloth. Beneath the vat, the firebox is a dark mouth, its iron grate cold and empty except for a scattering of pale ash from the day before. The bricks that hold the vat are blackened in places, stained with the history of 1,000 fires, and a small iron door hangs open from the front of the firebox, ready to be fed. Your tools hang along the wall to the right, each in its own place, each held by a loop of leather or a simple nail. The long-handled skimmer rests on 2 pegs, its flat perforated blade a dark circle of iron that seems to absorb light rather than reflect it. Below it, the stirring paddle leans against the wall, its wooden blade worn thin at the edges and smooth to the touch from countless slow circuits through thickening broth. A coil of coarse straining cloth lies on a shelf, folded neatly, smelling faintly of the glue it once caught and held. Near the door, a stack of wooden buckets waits, one inside another, their iron bands tight and their staves tight with age. Everything is as you left it, the order of the shed a quiet reassurance that the day will unfold exactly as it always does. You turn first to the pile of raw materials on the left side of the shed. It is a heap of hooves and hides, delivered 2 days ago from the slaughterhouse on the other side of the market square. The hooves are a jumbled collection of dark, horny shapes, some cloven, some whole, their edges chipped and their surfaces marked with the fine parallel lines that speak of growth. They are dry and hard, smelling of dust and old keratin, with bits of straw clinging to them from the carpet. Beside them, the hides are folded in rough squares, their outer surfaces still bearing patches of coarse hair and the pale residue of lime that was used to loosen the fur. They are stiff and unforgiving, like sheets of thick cardboard, and they exhale a sharper, earthier note, an animal scent that has not yet been softened by water and heat. You look at the pile without counting, knowing by sight whether it will fill the vat or leave room for more. Next, you check the water barrel. It stands against the back wall, a large oaken cask fitted with a wooden tap near its base. You lift the lid and peer inside, seeing the dark surface of the water shimmer as your breath disturbs it. The level is low, just above the halfway mark, so you note in the back of your mind that you will need to make several trips to the pump in the yard later. The water itself is clear and cold, drawn from the deep well that serves the town and it smells of nothing but a faint, clean earthiness that reminds you of wet stones. You replace the lid carefully, letting it settle into its groove with a soft, hollow thud that is the first real sound of the day. Now, with the inventory complete, you move to open the shutters. The shed has two small windows, one on each side of the door, and each is fitted with a wooden shutter that hinges outward. You reach up to the first one, working the iron hook free from its eye, and push the shutter gently outward until it is caught by the leather strap that limits its swing. Grey light pours into the shed, flat and directionless, revealing the dust motes that hang in the still air like tiny sleeping things. You repeat the motion with the second shutter, and now the shed is no longer a cavern but a workspace. Its corners soften but visible, its clutter given shape and purpose. The light falls directly on the vat, and you can see the residue from yesterday's batch still inside. It is a thin, gelatinous skin that has formed across the surface of the remaining liquid as it cooled overnight, a translucent membrane the color of weak tea. It holds the shape of the vat's last stir, frozen in faint whorls and ridges. You lean over the rim and look at it, noting the way the gel quivers almost imperceptibly when you breathe, a sign that the batch was a good one, properly boiled and slowly cooled. Beneath this skin, the liquid is dark and still, resting after its long, hot journey. You decide to leave the residue for now. It will be incorporated into today's boil, adding body and strength to the new batch. Instead, you gather the buckets for the first task, bringing fresh water to fill the vat. You take 2 buckets, their bales solid in your grip, and walk back out into the yard. The pump is a cast-iron standpipe about 20 yards from the shed, its handle worn bright by the hands of many users. You place the first bucket under the spout, grip the handle with both hands, and begin to work it up and down in a slow, steady rhythm. The pump gurgles and wheezes for a moment, then releases a gush of cold water that hits the bottom of the bucket with a ringing sound that softens as the water rises. You fill the first bucket within an inch of the brim, then the second, and carry them back to the shed, your boots making a soft, measured tread on the packed earth. Pouring water into the vat is a careful act. You tip the first bucket slowly, letting the stream fall against the inner copper wall rather than directly into the center, so as not to disturb the gelatinous skin more than necessary. The water slides down the curb surface, merging with the residue, the 2 liquids meeting in a slow swirl that gradually raises the level. The second bucket follows, then the third and fourth, each trip to the pump and back taking the same number of steps, the same careful pour. The sound of water against copper changes as the vat fills, from a deep, booming resonance to a higher, closer splash. You stop when the water reaches the notch scratched inside the rim, a mark you made years ago with a nail, and that has since been darkened by countless batches. The vat is now half full, a lake of cold, clear water resting above a layer of yesterday's concentrated stock. You set down the buckets and turn your attention to the hooves. You lift them one at a time from the pile, feeling their weight and texture, and you examine each briefly for any clinging matter that might cloud the glue. A piece of straw, a small stone, a fragment of hoof wall that has already begun to splinter, all are removed and tossed aside into a wooden box that you will take to the compost heap later. The cleaned hooves go into the vat, one after another, each making a dull, solid plop that sends ripples across the surface and then is gone. Some sink immediately, their density carrying them down to rest on the copper bottom. Others float for a moment, their curved inner surfaces trapping a bubble of air before the water soaks in and they slowly descend, settling among their fellows with a soft, final motion. The pile of hooves diminishes, transferred now into the waiting water. Their colors range from near black to a pale, horn-like amber, and as they sit in the vat, they seem to soften just slightly, the water beginning its long work of extraction. You look at the water now, its surface returning to stillness, the hooves a dark, irregular mound just below. The shed is silent again, except for the faint sound of a single drip from the pump outside, a sound so regular and distant that it feels less like a noise and more like the slow pulse of the morning itself. Now you are ready to lay the fire. You go to the wood store, a lean-to attached to the side of the shed, and select a handful of dry straw from a bound sheaf. Back at the firebox, you kneel and place the straw in a loose nest, then take a few splinters of pine kindling, and lay them across it, their thin edges sharp and smelling of resin. On these you place slightly thicker sticks, their bark crumbly and dry, arranged not in a grid but in a casual open pattern that will let air move freely. You pause, brush a bit of dust from your apron, and reach for the tin box of matches that sits on a small shelf near the door. The match strikes with a soft hiss and erupts into a tiny, wavering flame. You cup your hand around it and touch it to the straw, which catches with a sudden, eager crackle. The flame spreads quickly, feeding on the dry grass and then licking upward into the kindling. The pine pops quietly, its resin bubbling and sending up thin, fragrant curls of smoke that escape through the open firebox door. You watch without hurry, waiting for the sticks to catch fully, adding one or two more as needed until the flames are established and a steady, bright orange glow fills the dark interior of the firebox. Next come the small lumps of coal. You select them from a bucket, choosing pieces no larger than your fist, and place them gently on the burning wood, one at a time. Each lump sits for a moment, dark and inert, before a thin blue flame begins to dance around its edges, and then it too catches. The firebox now hums with energy, the heat pushing outward and warming the iron plate beneath the vat. You close the firebox door halfway, adjusting the draft with a small iron slide until the burn is steady and the smoke rises cleanly through the chimney, a pale grey feather against the pale grey sky. You stand and stretch your back, feeling the warmth begin to seep into the shed. The copper of the vat is no longer cold to the touch. A faint heat has begun to spread upward from the base, and the water inside gives off the first, barely perceptible change in smell, a slight warming of the hooves' natural odor. You take your place on the low wooden stool near the vat, settling in for the long, slow climb to a simmer. The work of preparation is done, and now the shed settles around you into a rhythm that is older than the town, older than the market square, older than memory. The fire ticks softly in its brick bed. The water waits. The day, in its quiet and unhurried way, has properly begun. You kneel on the packed earth before the firebox, the cool morning air still clinging to the shoulders of your coat, despite the closed door of the shed. The firebox is a black iron mouth set into the brick base that holds the copper vat, its grate a row of parallel bars worn thin by heat and years. Ashes from yesterday's fire lie in a soft grey drift beneath the grate, fine as flour and still carrying a faint memory of warmth. You reach for the small wire brush that hangs from a nail beside the firebox and sweep the ashes gently forward, coaxing them into the ashpan, a shallow iron tray that slides out with a dry, gritty sound. You empty the ashpan into the bucket by the door, watching the pale dust tumble and settle in a soft mound that will later be scattered on the garden path behind the shed. Now the firebox is clean and open, ready to receive its first offerings of the day. You turn to the wood store, a narrow lean-to attached to the shed's outer wall, where split logs, kindling and straw are kept dry under a slanted roof of corrugated iron. The straw is tied in a sheaf with a twist of baling twine, golden and brittle, smelling of a summer that ended long ago. You pull a generous handful free, feeling the hollow stems crackle and break against your palm, and you carry it back to the firebox, letting a few loose strands drift down to the floor, where they will lie until the evening sweep. You tuck the straw into a loose, airy nest on the grate, shaping it with your fingers so that it forms a soft bowl that will cradle the first small flames. Next, you select a few thin splinters of pine kindling from the box beside the wood store. These splinters are the remains of a plank that a carpenter in the town discarded, and you split them yourself with a hatchet on a slow afternoon, reducing the board to a pile of slender, resinous strips that curl slightly at the edges. You take 4 of them and lay them across the straw nest in a simple star pattern, their tips meeting in the center, but leaving plenty of space for air to move between them. The pine is pale and dry, its surface dotted with tiny knots that catch the faint light from the open shutters, and as you handle them, your fingertips pick up a sticky trace of the resin that gives the wood its sharp, sweet scent. On top of the kindling you now place slightly thicker sticks, pieces of birch and alder that you gathered from the hedge line last autumn, and stacked to season. They are no thicker than your thumb, their bark peeling in papery curls, their broken ends showing a clean, white wood that still holds a hint of moisture deep within. You arrange them, not in a careful grid, but in a casual crisscross, each stick resting lightly on the ones below, so that when the fire takes hold, the flames will find easy passage upward through the gaps. The structure is small and unassuming, a tiny wooden architecture that will last only a few minutes once the match is struck, but its purpose is vital, a bridge of heat that will carry the fire from the fleeting straw to the enduring coal. Everything is ready. You sit back on your heels for a moment, your hands resting on your thighs, and you look at the cold, dark interior of the firebox with its little pile of fuel, waiting like a promise. The shed is quiet except for the sound of your own breathing and the distant, irregular drip of the pump outside. Then you reach for the tin box of matches that lives on a small shelf carved into the wall beside the firebox, its lid worn smooth from the daily friction of your thumb. You slide the lid open and take out a single match, a slim wooden stick with a bulbous red head that smells faintly of sulfur and phosphorus even before it is struck. You close the tin and place it back on the shelf. Then you hold the match against the rough striking surface on the side of the box. With a single unhurried motion, you draw the match across the emery strip. It ignites with a soft rushing hiss, the flame bursting into a small wavering teardrop of blue and yellow that shivers in the still air of the shed. You cup your free hand around it automatically, a habit born of countless mornings, and you lower the flame to the edge of the straw nest where the drier strands wait. The straw catches at once, a tiny orange thread that races along a single hollow stem and then leaps to its neighbor with a sound that is less a crackle than a contented, rustling sigh. You withdraw your hand and place the spent match carefully on a small stone ledge beside the firebox, where it will lie until it cools enough to be thrown away. The fire spreads quickly through the straw, the flames now a bright, dancing curtain that lights up the inside of the firebox and casts your kneeling shadow large against the back wall of the shed. The straw burns fast, its brief life a flare of heat that blackens the stems and reduces them to fragile, ghostly skeletons that collapse inward as the fire moves on. Already the flames are licking at the pine kindling, and the resin within the wood begins to bubble and hiss, sending up tiny jets of oily smoke that curl against the iron roof of the firebox before finding their way to the chimney. The smell of burning pine fills the shed, sharp and clean and reminiscent of a forest after a lightning strike, and it mingles with the fading odor of yesterday's glue that still lingers in the copper of the vat. You watch the fire with patient attention, your eyes following the movement of the flames as they wrap themselves around the kindling and then reach upward for the thicker sticks. The pine splinters blacken and glow at their edges, and one of them cracks loudly, splitting along a grain line and releasing a shower of tiny sparks that wink out before they touch anything. Now the birch and alder sticks begin to catch, their bark curling back and darkening, their inner wood first steaming slightly as the last of its moisture is driven out in a thin white wisp and then igniting into a steady golden flame. The fire is no longer a tentative flickering thing, but a solid presence, a small contained sun that hums with energy and pushes a wash of heat outward through the open door of the firebox. The iron of the stove begins to respond. At first the change is invisible, just a faint tightening in the metal plates that you can sense more than see. Then the firebox itself gives a quiet, low tick, a sound like a pebble dropped into deep water as the iron expands by a fraction of a breath. A moment later another ping follows, this one higher and sharper from somewhere near the chimney pipe. These are the sounds of a waking stove, the small metallic conversations that accompany the slow gathering of warmth, and they reassure you that the fire is taking hold properly, that the heat is moving in the right direction. Now it is time to add the coal. You rise from your kneeling position, your knees making a soft popping sound that you ignore, and you walk to the coal bucket that sits by the door. The coal is a dark, dull black, broken into pieces no larger than your fist. Its surface is rough and angular and filmed with a fine, glittering dust. You pick up a single lump and feel its unexpected lightness, the way it seems to be more air than stone, a remnant of ancient forests compressed by time and earth into this brittle, combustible form. You carry the lump back to the firebox and place it carefully on the bed of burning sticks, positioning it so that it rests not directly on the flames but just to the side, where the heat will warm it gradually rather than shocking it all at once. You wait, watching the coal. For a long moment, nothing seems to happen. The lump sits there, dark and inert, a foreign object among the dancing flames. Then a faint blue halo begins to flicker around its edges, a thin, almost invisible flame that dances without sound. The surface of the coal takes on a subtle glow, a deep internal red that spreads slowly like a blush. Tiny cracks appear, and the lump begins to pop and sputter softly, releasing small pockets of trapped gas that ignite in brief ethereal coronas. The smell of burning coal is different from the wood, less sweet and more mineral, a dry, stony scent that recalls rain on hot rocks and the distant smoke of railway engines. It fills the shed in a new layer, settling over the pine and the old glue and the damp earth, building the complex atmosphere that will accompany the day's work. You turn back to the coal bucket and bring a second lump, placing it next to the first and watching it undergo the same slow transformation, its surface shifting from black to grey and then to the intense, internal orange of ember. One by one you add more lumps, each time waiting for the new piece to catch fully before adding the next, building the fire in small, incremental steps that ensure every piece of fuel contributes its share of heat. The firebox now holds a deep, mature bed of coals, the flames no longer visible as distinct shapes but merged into a steady, pulsing glow that radiates heat outward in waves. You close the firebox door but leave the small sliding vent at its base open a crack, allowing just enough air to sustain the burn without racing through the fuel too quickly. The heat travels. It moves from the firebox into the iron plate that supports the base of the copper vat, and from there, it begins its patient, invisible climb through the thick metal of the vat itself. The copper is a willing conductor, and soon the bottom of the vat is no longer cool to the touch, but distinctly warm, a gentle heat that you can feel if you place your palm against the curved side. The water inside the vat, the many buckets you poured so carefully, starts to receive this warmth at its lowest point, where the copper and the liquid meet. There is no visible change yet, no steam or movement, but a slow transfer of energy has begun, molecule by molecule, the heat spreading upward through the water in a quiet, inevitable progression. You settle yourself on the wooden stool and let the fire do its work. The stove continues its soft metallic commentary, a random sequence of ticks and pings and the occasional low groan as the plate shifts slightly in its frame. The smell of warm brick joins the other scents in the shed, a dry, dusty fragrance that rises from the masonry surrounding the firebox as the heat soaks into the clay and lime. The bricks themselves change color subtly, their reddish-brown surfaces darkening to a deeper, smoked hue, and if you look closely, you can see a faint, shimmering heat haze rising from the top of the firebox where it meets the vat. Time in the shed now takes on a different quality, stretching out into a long, slow ribbon that is measured not by the clock but by the small, incremental changes in the fire. You watch the coal bed settle and shift as the lumps burn down, their edges crumbling into glowing fragments that fall through the grate to join the growing pile of fresh ash below. You watch the color of the coals change from bright orange to a deeper, cherry red, and then you rise to add a few more lumps from the bucket, dropping them onto the established bed and hearing the soft, glassy clink as they settle among their burning companions. The fire, once established, is a patient beast, needing only these small offerings now and then to keep its heart beating strongly beneath the vat. The shed itself grows warmer, the chill of the early morning retreating into the corners and then disappearing altogether. The air thickens with heat and the layered smells of combustion, and you loosen the collar of your shirt slightly, feeling the first faint prickle of perspiration on your neck. The water in the barrel against the walls sweats too, its oaken surface beading with tiny droplets of condensation that catch the grey light and hold it like tiny lenses. Everything in the shed is waking now, responding to the fire's steady, generous outpouring, and you sit in the center of this slow transformation, a quiet figure in a patchwork coat, waiting for the water to speak its first small bubble of steam. With the fire burning steadily and the vat beginning its slow, quiet reception of warmth, you turn your attention back to the pile of hooves that waits against the shed wall. The pile has not changed since you first looked at it in the grey half-light of morning, but now the shed itself has changed. The air is thicker, softer, carrying the first gentle exhalation of heated copper and the faint mineral breath of the coal bed. The light from the open shutters has shifted from pearl to a pale, watery gold, and it falls across the heap of hooves in a slanting column that picks out the ridges and hollows of each dark shape. The hooves lie in a casual jumble, some turned on their sides, some resting with their concave undersurfaces facing upward like dark, shallow bowls. They are dry and cool to the touch, their horny surfaces marked with the fine, parallel striations that track the years of an animal's growth, and they carry a faint, dusty scent that has nothing yet of the deep, earthy odor they will release when the heat finds them. Before you begin adding the hooves to the vat, you pause for a moment to check the water level. This is not a hurried check, but a slow, deliberate ritual, one that you perform at the start of every batch with the same careful attention. You walk to the wooden peg near the door where a measuring stick hangs from a loop of cord, a simple length of straight-grained pine that you cut and shaped yourself many seasons ago. The stick is darkened at one end from being dipped repeatedly into hot liquor, and near that darkened tip you have carved a shallow notch with a small cross line above it, a mark that indicates the correct fill level when the water is cold. You carry the stick to the vat, feeling its familiar weight and smoothness, and you lower it slowly into the water, keeping it vertical and steady. The dark end disappears first, swallowed by the clear liquid, and then the shaft slides downward until the notch aligns exactly with the copper rim. You hold it there for a moment, letting the small ripples from the insertion settle, and then you withdraw the stick and examine the wet line. The water has climbed to the notch, no more and no less, the measurement exactly what it should be. Some days the level is low, a sign that the barrel needs refilling or that you were distracted in your morning routine. But today the water sits perfectly at its mark, and you feel a small, quiet satisfaction that is less an emotion than a simple recognition of order. You return the measuring stick to its peg, and then you walk to the pile of hooves. You do not carry them all at once, but instead bring a wooden bucket, a half barrel with rope handles, and place it beside the heap. Then you begin the slow, methodical work of loading the bucket, selecting each hoof individually, turning it over in your hands, and checking it for any clinging matter that might cloud the glue. A hoof lifted from the pile reveals the pale, chalky residue of lime that was used to loosen the outer layers at the slaughterhouse, a fine white dust that rubs off on your fingers and smells faintly of old stone. You brush this dust away with your thumb, working the curved surface until it is clean and smooth, and then you place the hoof in the bucket with a soft, hollow clack. The next hoof has a small, embedded pebble trapped in a crevice, and you pry it out with the tip of your pocket knife, dropping the pebble into a small tin can that you keep for such debris. The hoof follows the first into the bucket, and then another and another, each one inspected, cleaned, and deposited with the same unhurried motion, a rhythm that feels less like work and more like a meditation, your hands moving through the familiar gestures without the need for conscious thought. The bucket fills by degrees, the hooves settling against each other with a series of dry, bony clicks that speak of their hardness. When the bucket is full but not heaped, you lift it by its rope handles and carry it to the side of the vat. The heat from the firebox warms your legs as you stand there, and you can feel the faint tremor of the simmer not yet arrived, a premonition of warmth that rises from the copper and wraps around your hands. You set the bucket on the brick ledge beside the vat, and then you begin to add the hooves to the water one at a time. You do not toss them in or drop them from a height, but lower each one gently, letting it slide from your fingers into the liquid with a soft, deliberate motion that disturbs the surface as little as possible. The first hoof breaks the water with a quiet plop, sending out a ring of tiny ripples that spread and fade. It sinks immediately, the dense horn cutting through the clear liquid and settling on the copper bottom with a muffled final sound that travels up through the metal and into your palms. The second hoof does the same, and then the third, each one finding its place among the others, the water now beginning to take on the faintest hint of cloudiness as the soluble proteins within the hooves start their long, slow dissolution. The process continues, steady and unworried, the bucket emptying hoof by hoof, while the pile against the wall shrinks in small incremental stages. You work without counting, trusting your hands and eyes to judge the right load, a knowledge that has grown over years of boiling and that now resides somewhere deeper than memory. The hooves vary in size and shape, some broad and flat, others narrow and deep, and each one enters the water with a slightly different sound, a low thud for the heavy ones, a higher, sharper plop for the smaller, split pieces. The water level rises slightly with the displacement, climbing a fraction of an inch up the inner copper wall, and you note this without concern, knowing that the volume was calculated to absorb this very addition. The surface of the water, once a smooth, reflective disk, now shows a faint, trembling movement, the beginning of a convection current set up by the heat from below, a slow, circular drift that stirs the submerged hooves and helps the water find every crevice and hollow. When the first bucket is empty, you return to the pile and fill it again, repeating the same patient sequence of inspection and cleaning. A small piece of straw has woven itself into a cleft of one hoof, and you pull it free, watching the dry golden fiber drift to the floor where it will join the other bits of shed debris that accumulate during the day's work. Another hoof has a small crack running along its outer edge, a split that must have happened during the animal's life or perhaps during the rough handling at the yard, and you run your thumb along it, feeling the sharp splintery edges before placing it gently in the bucket. The work is not rushed because there is no reason to rush. The fire will burn for hours, the water will not boil away. The day stretches ahead in a long, uninterrupted line that asks nothing of you except your presence and your steady, unhurried attention. As you add the second bucket of hooves to the vat, the water begins to show the first true signs of warming. A few tiny bubbles have formed on the surface, not the rolling bubbles of a boil, but minuscule glassy pearls that cling to the hooves and then detach and rise slowly, bursting without a sound. The water itself has grown slightly less clear, a faint, milky haze spreading upward from the bottom where the hooves rest, as if the heat is coaxing out the first soluble threads of keratin and protein. The smell of the vat has deepened too, moving from the neutral scent of cold water to something warmer and more animal, a mild, horny fragrance that fills the shed and mingles with the coal smoke and the hot copper in a way that is not unpleasant, just present, a reminder of the transformation that is beginning. You pause now and then to wipe your hands on a cloth hanging from your belt, and to check the fire. A glance through the small vent at the base of the firebox shows a bed of glowing coals, their deep orange heart pulsing gently as the draft moves over them. You add a single lump of coal, placing it carefully, and then return to the hooves. The pile is now noticeably smaller, the heap having been reduced to a scattered layer on the floor, and you bend to gather the last few pieces, your fingers finding the cool, curved shapes and bringing them to the light. These final hooves are smaller, perhaps from younger animals, their edges smoother, and their color a lighter, more translucent amber. They feel different in your hand, less dense, more fragile, and you place them in the vat with an extra degree of gentleness, as if you were laying down something that might break. They float for a moment, their hollow interiors trapping a small pocket of air, and then they too sink, joining the dark submerged mass that now forms a low mound on the copper floor. With the last hoof in the water, you take a step back and look at the vat. The surface has stilled again, the convection current having slowed to a near stasis, and the water is now the color of weak tea with a milky undertone. The first gentle extraction already undertone. The first gentle extraction already underway. Light from the window falls across the copper rim and refracts through the liquid, casting a faint, dancing pattern on the opposite wall. The heat is perceptible now, not just at the base, but throughout the vat, a gentle, pervasive warmth that you can feel when you hold your hand a few inches above the surface, a soft, moist pressure against your palm. The shed is filled with the quiet, constant sound of the fire, a low murmur that underlies everything, and with the faint, steady drip of the pump outside, and with the deep, settling silence of a space that asks nothing more of you for a while. You pick up the empty bucket and carry it back to its place near the door. Then you take a cloth and wipe down the brick ledge where a few drops of water have spilled, removing any trace of the work you have just done. The measuring stick goes back on its peg, the tins and brushes and scoops are returned to their hooks, and the pile of hooves is now just a memory, a dusting of fine, horny powder on the floor where they once lay. You will sweep this later, when the evening comes and the work is winding down, but for now you leave it, a small reminder of the morning's labor. You settle once more onto the low wooden stool, your position near the vat, but not so close that the heat becomes uncomfortable, and you let your hands rest on your knees. The fire continues its steady, patient burn, and the water, now full of its load of hooves, continues its slow, patient journey toward the simmer. The day outside has moved on, the grey half-light giving way to a paler, fuller morning, and through the open shutters you can see the hedge of hawthorn and the pale blue sky beyond it, a sky that holds no threat of rain. A bird calls somewhere in the field, a single liquid note that hangs in the air and then fades. Inside the shed, the copper vat ticks softly as it expands, and the water makes a faint, sighing sound as the first true tendrils of steam begin to rise from the surface, thin and hesitant, curling upward into the warm, still air and vanishing like breath on a cold day. The work of the morning is done, and the long, slow simmer of the afternoon has not yet begun, leaving a quiet interval in which nothing moves and nothing is needed. A pause that is not empty, but full of the gentle, accumulated weight of a task performed with care. With the last hoof settled on the copper floor of the vat and the measuring stick hung back on its peg, you take your place on the low wooden stool and let the shed settle around you. The morning's active work is done, the carrying and pouring and cleaning now behind you, and what lies ahead is a different kind of labor, a labor of waiting. This waiting is not an absence of effort, but a slow, attentive stillness, a patience that you have learned over many seasons of boiling, and it asks only that you sit, watch, and listen as the water begins its long, silent climb toward the simmer. The fire beneath the vat has now settled into a steady, mature burn. Through the small viewing vent in the firebox door, you can see the bed of coals pulsing with a deep, even orange, their surfaces dappled with fleeting shadows as the draft moves over them. The flames are no longer visible as separate dancing tongues, but have merged into a soft, shimmering glow that fills the iron chamber with a quiet, constant radiance. The sound of the fire is a low, continuous murmur, a sound so steady that after a while it disappears from your conscious attention, becoming simply the background hum of the shed, as much a part of the space as the walls and the roof. Every few minutes, a coal shifts with a tiny glassy clink, or a pocket of trapped gas escapes with a faint puff. But these are the only interruptions to the fire's steady song. The heat from the firebox travels upward through the iron plate and into the thick, curved bottom of the copper vat. Copper is a willing conductor, eager to receive warmth and pass it along, and now the entire base of the vat is hot to the touch, a heat that would sting your palm if you pressed it there for more than a moment. This heat does not stay at the bottom, but begins its patient migration upward through the water, molecule by molecule, in a slow, invisible convection that sets the entire contents of the vat into a gentle, circular motion. You cannot see this motion directly, but you can sense it in the way the surface of the water trembles faintly, a soft, almost imperceptible shiver that speaks of the warmth rising from below. The water itself has changed since you filled the vat this morning. Then it was a clear, cold lake, reflecting the grey light from the shutters with a flat, mirror-like stillness. Now it is a different substance entirely, a liquid that is no longer cold but tepid, its clarity dulled by the faint, milky haze that the hooves have begun to release. The soluble proteins and keratins within the hooves are slowly giving themselves up to the water, dissolving at a pace so gradual that it would be invisible if you did not already know it was happening. The color of the liquid is now a pale, cloudy amber, like weak tea that has been diluted with far too much milk, and it deepens almost imperceptibly as the minutes pass, the shade shifting from cream to fawn and then to a slightly richer, warmer tone that holds the promise of the darker liquor to come. You sit on the stool with your hands resting loosely on your thighs, your back straight but not stiff, your eyes moving slowly across the surface of the vat. The first small bubbles appear almost without warning. They are not the large, rolling bubbles of a boil, but tiny glassy pearls that form on the submerged hooves and then detach with a soft, silent motion, rising upward through the water and breaking at the surface without a sound. At first they are few and far between, a single bubble here, another there, separated by long minutes of stillness. Then, as the water continues to warm, they begin to appear in small clusters, a constellation of minuscule spheres that cling to the copper wall where the heat is most intense, and then release in tiny silver threads that spiral upward and vanish. The surface of the vat now shows a faint trembling motion, a gentle quiver that is not yet a simmer, but the first premonition of one. The sounds of the heating vat are subtle and varied, a quiet concert that plays just at the edge of hearing. The copper itself ticks and pings as it expands, the metal sheets shifting against their riveted seams with a sound like distant pebbles falling on stone. The water makes a faint, sighing sound as the convection currents move through it, a low, watery whisper that rises and falls in no particular rhythm. The fire continues its steady murmur beneath everything, a constant, reassuring presence, and outside the shed, the pump drips its slow, irregular beat, a sound that has been going on for so long that you no longer notice it unless you deliberately listen. Steam begins to rise from the surface of the water. At first, it is barely there, a thin, hesitant tendril that curls upward from the center of the vat and dissipates almost immediately into the warm air of the shed. Then another tendril appears, and another, each one a little thicker and a little more persistent than the last, until there is a constant, gentle column of vapor rising from the vat, pale and translucent, twisting and folding in on itself as it meets the cooler air near the roof. The steam carries with it the smell of the warming hooves, a scent that has deepened and matured since the morning, moving from the dusty, neutral smell of dry horn to a richer, earthier odor that fills the shed and clings to the wooden beams and the thatch. It is a smell that is difficult to describe, not precisely animal and not precisely vegetable, but something in between, a warm, organic fragrance that speaks of transformation and slow time. You rise from the stool now and then to check the fire, a ritual that you perform not because the fire needs you, but because the rhythm of checking is part of the day's fabric. You walk to the firebox, the soles of your boots making a soft scuffing sound on the packed earth floor, and you open the small iron door just a crack to peer inside. The coals are still glowing brightly, their color a deep, steady orange that tells you they have plenty of life left. You take a single lump of coal from the bucket, a piece about the size of your fist, its surface rough and glittering with fine black dust, and you place it carefully on the bed of embers. The coal sits there for a moment, dark and inert, then a pale blue flame begins to dance around its edges, and its surface takes on the first faint blush of heat. You close the door, adjust the draft slide so that the air flows freely but not too freely, and return to your stool, settling back into the quiet vigil. The climb to a simmer is not a sudden event, but a slow, gradual process that stretches out across the better part of an hour. The water temperature rises degree by degree, the heat spreading from the base of the vat upward through the entire volume of liquid, and with each passing minute the signs of the approaching simmer become a little more pronounced. The bubbles grow more numerous, no longer clinging to the hooves and the copper wall, but rising freely from the body of the water itself. Small glassy spheres that travel upward in lazy, spiraling paths and break at the surface with a barely audible plip. The steam thickens, the column of vapor above the vat becoming denser and more opaque, its edges curling and folding in the still air. The smell deepens further, taking on a richer, more complex character as the heat works its way into the very heart of the hooves, coaxing out the collagen and the gelatin that are the purpose of the whole enterprise. You notice these changes without remarking on them, your mind not precisely empty, but occupied with the simple sensory data of the shed, the warmth on your face, the smell in your nostrils, the quiet, rhythmic sounds of the fire and the water. This is the part of the day that you have always found most peaceful, this long, slow interval between the active work of the morning and the more demanding tasks of the afternoon. And you let it unfold at its own pace without any desire to hurry it along. The stool is comfortable enough, its wooden seat worn smooth by years of use, and the position of your body has become so familiar that it requires no thought, your spine settling into its natural curve, your shoulders dropping, your breathing slow and even. Outside the shed, the morning has now fully established itself. The grey half-light of dawn has given way to a pale, watery sun that filters through the open shutters and casts a soft, diffuse glow across the interior. The light captures the rising steam and makes it visible as a shifting, translucent curtain, and it picks out the grain of the wooden beams and the dark, weathered surface of the copper vat. The day is still, without wind, and the hedge of hawthorn beyond the door is motionless, its leaves hanging in the quiet air. A bird calls once, a single, liquid note that seems to hang in the stillness for a long moment before fading away. Then another bird answers from further off, and then silence again. The deep, rural silence of a market town that has not yet fully woken to its daily business. Inside the shed, the copper vat has now reached a temperature where the water begins to show the first true signs of a simmer. The bubbles are no longer isolated and sporadic, but have begun to form a ring around the inner circumference of the vat, a necklace of tiny trembling spheres that cling to the copper and then rise in a continuous gentle stream. The surface of the water is no longer flat and still, but has taken on a soft, rolling motion, a slow circular turn that carries the floating impurities from the edges toward the center and back again. This is the moment you have been waiting for, the transition from passive heating to active simmer, and you rise from the stool and walk to the vat, the long-handled skimmer already in your hand. You lower the skimmer gently into the water, the flat, perforated blade sliding beneath the surface without a splash. The foam that has begun to gather is pale and grayish, a light, airy froth that drifts in small, disconnected patches and has not yet formed a continuous layer. You guide the skimmer in a slow, sweeping motion, collecting the foam against the blade and then lifting it carefully from the water, tipping the contents into the wooden bucket that waits beside the vat. The foam slides off the skimmer with a soft, wet sound and settles in the bucket, a pale, insubstantial mass that will later be discarded. You repeat this motion several times, moving the skimmer in a slow, patient circuit around the inside of the vat, each sweep collecting a little more of the grey froth and leaving the water slightly clearer than before. The skimming is a quiet, meditative task, and you perform it without haste, your arm moving in a steady, rhythmic arc that has been learned over many years. The skimmer is light in your hand, its long handle perfectly balanced, and the perforated blade glides through the water with a soft, whispering sound that is barely audible above the murmur of the fire and the gentle rolling simmer of the vat. With each pass, the foam diminishes, the surface of the water growing smoother and more translucent, and the color of the liquid beneath becomes a little more visible, a pale golden brown that deepens as the simmer continues. When the skimming is done for now, you set the skimmer aside and return to the stool, knowing that more foam will rise as the simmer progresses, and that you will be called back to the vat many times before the day is over. The water has now fully entered its simmer, the surface rolling with a gentle, constant motion that is not a boil, but a soft, steady tremor, a state of quiet, ongoing transformation that will continue for hours. The hooves at the bottom of the vat are slowly giving up their substance, their hard, horny structures softening and breaking down as the heat and the water do their patient work, and the liquor that will eventually become glue is beginning to form, a thin, weak solution that will grow stronger and thicker as the day wears on. You sit and watch the simmer, the steam rising in a steady, unbroken column, the fire murmuring its low, constant song, the shed filled with warmth and the deep, organic smell of the brewing liquor. The long, slow climb is over, and the vat has reached the plateau where it will stay for many hours, neither too hot nor too cool, a perfect, gentle simmer that asks nothing more from you than your presence and your occasional unhurried attention. The day stretches out ahead, quiet and unhurried, and you settle into its rhythm like a stone settling into the bed of a slow-moving stream. The simmer has now established itself as a quiet, constant presence in the shed, a gentle, rolling motion that moves the surface of the liquid in a slow, circular turn. The water is no longer the cold, clear lake of the early morning, but a warm, living broth, its color a pale amber deepening toward gold, its surface trembling with the soft energy of the heat beneath. As you watch from the stool, the first true impurities begin to rise. They appear not all at once, but in scattered, tentative patches, a pale grayish foam that drifts across the surface like thin clouds moving over a pond. This foam is the soluble proteins and lighter fats that the heat has coaxed out of the hooves, substances that are not wanted in the final glue and must be removed before they can break down further and cloud the liquor. The appearance of this foam is a sign that the simmer has reached the right temperature, that the transformation inside the vat is proceeding exactly as it should, and it calls you back to your feet for the next stage of the day's patient work. You rise from the stool, your body unfolding slowly from its resting posture, and you walk to the wall where the long-handled skimmer hangs from its two pegs. The skimmer is a tool you know as well as your own hands. Its weight and balance as familiar as the feel of the wooden stool or the handle of the pump. The shaft is made of ash, a straight, smooth pole that has been darkened by years of steam and polished by the constant friction of your palms. At its end, fixed with an iron collar and a pair of small rivets, is the blade. The blade is a flat, circular disc of iron, slightly concave on its upper surface and pierced with a regular pattern of small holes that allow liquid to drain away while the solid foam is collected. Around the rim of the blade runs a shallow lip just high enough to hold the gathered froth without spilling, and the entire assembly is light enough to be wielded with one hand for hours without fatigue. You lift the skimmer from its pegs, feeling the smooth wood settle into your grip, and you carry it back to the side of the vat with the same unhurried pace that governs everything in the shed. Standing beside the copper vat, you pause for a moment to assess the foam. It has spread since you first noticed it, the scattered patches merging into a thin, continuous layer that covers perhaps a third of the surface. The color is a pale silvery gray, not unlike the scum that forms on a pot of boiling potatoes, and its texture is light and airy, a delicate froth that quivers with every small movement of the liquid beneath. The steam rising from the vat is thicker now, a steady opalescent column that carries the deep, warm smell of the heating hooves, a scent that has grown richer and more complex, filling the shed and clinging to the wooden beams. You adjust your grip on the skimmer and lower the blade slowly toward the surface, the iron disc descending without a splash, slipping beneath the foam with a soft, barely audible whisper. The first stroke is always a careful one, a gentle sweeping motion that tests the behavior of the foam and the resistance of the liquid. You guide the skimmer just beneath the surface, the perforated blade moving through the water with a smooth, even pressure, its holes allowing the liquid to pass through while the foam gathers against the iron. The motion begins near the edge of the vat where the foam is thickest, and you draw the skimmer inward toward the center in a slow, steady arc, watching as the grey froth piles up against the blade in a soft, yielding mass. When the blade is full, you lift it clear of the surface, tilting it slightly so that the liquid drains away through the holes, leaving only the collected impurities clinging to the iron. Then you carry the skimmer to the wooden bucket that waits on the brick ledge and tip the blade over it, letting the foam slide off with a soft, wet plop. The foam lands in the bucket, a pale, insubstantial heap that settles slowly, releasing a faint, steamy breath as it cools. You lower the skimmer again, and repeat the motion, starting a little further along the rim and drawing the blade in a new arc that overlaps slightly with the first. The second stroke gathers more foam, a slightly thinner layer this time, and you lift, drain, and tip again, the sequence flowing without a break, your arm moving through the familiar pattern with a rhythm that is as steady as a slow breath. The sound of the skimmer entering the water is a soft, liquid sigh, and the sound of the foam dropping into the bucket is a damp, muffled thud that varies slightly each time depending on how much froth the blade has caught. These two sounds alternate in a quiet, repetitive cadence, sigh and thud, and they merge with the murmur of the fire and the gentle, rolling simmer of the vat to create the steady, hypnotic music of the shed. As you work, you move slowly around the vat, shifting your position by a step or two after each stroke so that you can reach every part of the surface without straining. The motion of the skimmer is always the same, a smooth, level sweep that keeps the blade just below the foam without plunging too deep and disturbing the heavier liquid beneath. You have learned over many years exactly the right depth, a depth that is less than an inch below the surface, where the foam floats and the clear liquor has not yet been stirred. If you go too deep, you will pull up some of the good, protein-rich broth and waste it, and if you go too shallow, you will leave behind a film of froth that will later dissolve back into the batch and cloud the final glue. The right depth is a matter of feel, a subtle pressure against the skimmer handle that tells you when the blade is riding correctly, and you maintain it without conscious thought, your hands and arms knowing what to do long before your mind has formed the instruction. The foam changes as you work. The first thick layer is quickly removed, and the surface of the vat becomes clearer, the pale golden brown of the simmering liquor now visible through the remaining froth. But the simmer does not stop producing impurities, and within a minute or two of clearing a patch, a new scattering of grey flecks begins to appear, rising from below and spreading across the surface like fine dust settling in reverse. You watch this process with calm attention, understanding that skimming is not a task that can be finished, but one that must be repeated at intervals, a slow, ongoing conversation with the vat that will last for many hours. The new foam is lighter and sparser than the first, and you collect it with gentler strokes, barely disturbing the surface. The skimmer moving like a spoon through thin cream. The steam thickens around you as you work, the air in the shed growing warmer and more humid until a fine, moist warmth settles on your skin and soaks into the fibers of your shirt. The smell of the vat is now fully developed, a deep, organic fragrance that speaks of the slow breakdown of keratin and collagen, a scent that is neither pleasant nor unpleasant, but simply dense and real. The smell of old horn and warm hide, and the faint, mineral tang of the copper itself. This smell wraps around you like a heavy blanket, and you breathe it in without noticing. Your senses long accustomed to the atmosphere of the shed. The light from the open shutters has changed again, the pale morning sun having climbed higher and now falling more directly through the windows, catching the steam and turning it into a shifting, luminous veil that glows softly in the dim interior. You pause after a while, straightening your back and resting the skimmer against the rim of the vat, its blade suspended just above the surface so that the remaining liquid drips back into the broth with a slow, intermittent patter. During this pause, you look into the bucket and see the pile of grey foam that has accumulated there, a light, frothy mound that shimmers faintly with trapped heat. It looks like the head on a badly poured ale, but it smells entirely different, warm and animal, and you know that later you will carry this bucket out and spread the contents on the garden behind the shed where the earth will take it in and turn it into something useful. For now, you simply note its volume and return your attention to the vat, where a fresh scattering of foam has already begun to gather. You resume the skimming, the rhythm of the work settling over you like a familiar garment. Each stroke of the skimmer is a small, complete act, a tiny cycle of collection and removal that has its own beginning, middle and end, and yet each stroke is also part of a larger, continuous flow that has no clear boundary. The ash handle is warm now from your grip and from the steam, and the iron blade has picked up a faint, oily sheen from the impurities it has gathered, a sheen that catches the light when you lift it clear of the surface. You wipe the blade occasionally with a rag that hangs from your belt, cleaning away the residue so that it does not build up and interfere with the next pass, and then you lower it again and continue. The sounds of the shed have a layered, hypnotic quality. The sigh of the skimmer and the thud of the foam dropping into the bucket, the murmur of the fire and the soft rolling simmer of the vat, the distant drip of the pump outside, and the occasional far-off call of a bird in the hedgerow, all these sounds weaving together into a fabric of quiet noise that fills the space and pushes back the silence. You are aware of these sounds without listening to them, your mind in a state that is neither fully attentive nor fully absent, but somewhere in between, a calm, drifting awareness that notices the small changes without reacting to them. The foam on the surface of the vat rises and is removed in a slow, patient cycle that mirrors the slow, patient cycle of the fire consuming the coal, the water evaporating into steam, the hooves giving up their substance to the broth. As the morning moves toward its midpoint, the nature of the foam begins to shift. The first impurities that rose were pale grey and light, the easily released proteins and fats that the heat quickly drove to the surface. Now the foam that appears is slightly darker, a deeper grey with hints of tan, and its texture is a little heavier, clinging more tenaciously to the skimmer blade and requiring a firmer tap against the rim of the bucket to dislodge it. This change tells you that the simmer has progressed, that the heat is now working on the deeper structures of the hooves, drawing out the more stubborn impurities that were trapped within the dense, horny material. You adjust your technique accordingly, using a slightly deeper stroke and holding the blade in the water a moment longer to let the liquid drain fully before lifting it clear. The work remains steady and unhurried, the adjustment so small that an observer would not notice it, but you feel it in the subtle change of pressure against your hand and the slightly heavier weight of the loaded skimmer. The bucket fills slowly, the foam settling and compacting under its own weight until what was a light, airy mound becomes a denser, more solid mass. You know from experience that you will need to empty the bucket at least once before the day is over, carrying it out to the garden and returning with it clean and ready for the next round of skimming. For now, however, there is still room, and you continue to add to it each tip of the skimmer, depositing a new layer of grey froth on top of the old. The surface of the vat, in the intervals between skimming passes, grows momentarily clear and then slowly films over again, a cycle that repeats itself with a regularity that is almost like a pulse, a slow, natural rhythm that your own movements have come to match. You find a rhythm, too, in the way you move around the vat, a slow, shuffling circuit that brings you back to your starting point after every 8 or 10 strokes. This circuit is not a perfect circle, but a slightly irregular path that avoids the firebox on one side and the pile of hides on the other, and you follow it without looking down, your feet finding the familiar dips and rises of the earth floor with the same automatic knowledge that guides the skimmer. The steam parts around you as you move, swirling in soft eddies that are disturbed by your passage, and then close again behind you, a shifting, translucent curtain that makes the far corners of the shed seem distant and unreal. From time to time you pause to check the fire, adding a lump of coal or adjusting the draft slide to keep the heat steady. The firebox is a glowing orange heart, its coals pulsing with a deep internal light that seems to breathe in time with the simmer of the vat. The coal you add catches quickly, a pale blue flame licking around its edges before it settles into the bed and becomes indistinguishable from the rest. You close the iron door and return to the skimmer, picking up the rhythm exactly where you left it, the interruption so brief that it barely registers. The skimming continues through the late morning, the sun climbing higher outside, and the light in the shed shifting from the soft, diffuse glow of early day to a sharper, more defined brightness that cuts through the steam and picks out the grain of the wooden beams and the dark, weathered surface of the copper. The foam rises more slowly now, the vat having given up the bulk of its first impurities and settling into a quieter phase of the simmer. You skim with longer intervals between passes, the work becoming less a continuous task and more a series of brief, periodic checks, a glance at the surface, a sweep of the skimmer, and then a return to the stool to wait. The stool has become a familiar perch, its wooden seat shaped by your weight over the years, and you settle onto it with a quiet sense of completion, knowing that the first skimming is done and that the vat is now moving into the long, slow middle of its day. The shed has now settled into a steady, enveloping warmth, the kind of warmth that seeps into the wooden beams and the packed earth floor and stays there, a gentle, pervasive presence that wraps around you like a heavy blanket. The fire murmurs its low, constant song beneath the copper vat, and the surface of the simmering liquor rolls with a soft, circular motion that never stops and never hurries. The first skimming is done, the pale grey foam removed and stored in the bucket, and the liquid in the vat has taken on a clearer, more translucent quality. Its colour a deepening amber that catches the light from the open shutters and holds it like a jewel. The hooves at the bottom of the vat have now been simmering for several hours, their hard, horny structures softening and releasing their soluble proteins into the broth. And as they do so, they give off an odour that has been building since the first small bubbles appeared. This odour is now the dominant presence in the shed, a heavy, organic fragrance that fills every corner and clings to every surface. And it is this smell that will accompany the next stage of the day's work. The smell of the simmering hooves is not a sharp or acrid smell, not the kind of smell that stings the nostrils or makes you turn away. It is instead a deep, earthy, dense smell, a smell that seems to have weight and texture, as though the air itself has thickened and grown richer. It carries within it notes of warm keratin and old horn, a faint sweetness like the breath of a balm, and a darker, more animal undertone that speaks of the hide still waiting against the wall. The smell has layers, some of them immediate and forward, others lingering in the background, and it changes subtly as the simmer continues, deepening and mellowing in the same way that the colour of the liquor deepens and mellows. To someone unused to this work, the smell might seem overwhelming or strange, but to you it is simply the smell of the shed in full production, as familiar as the scent of rain on dry earth or the cool green fragrance of the hawthorn hedge in spring. You breathe it in without thinking, your senses long attuned to its presence, and it settles into your clothing and your hair, becoming part of you for the rest of the day. With the first round of skimming complete and the vat simmering steadily, you turn your attention now to the stack of hides that have been waiting against the left wall of the shed since the morning. The hides are folded in rough, heavy squares, their outer surfaces still bearing the pale, chalky residue of lime that was applied at the slaughterhouse to loosen the hair and preserve the skins. They are stiff and unyielding, like thick sheets of old cardboard, and they carry their own distinct smell, a sharper, earthier note that mingles with the warm, horny scent of the vat to create the full, complex aroma that will mark the middle of the day. The hides are not fresh. They have been cured and dried, their moisture driven out so that they can be stored without spoiling, and now they are ready to be added to the broth, where they will release their own collagen and gelatin and contribute to the strength of the final glue. You walk to the pile of hides and lift the topmost sheet, feeling its weight and its resistance in your hands. The hide is roughly square, about the size of a small tablecloth, and its surface is rough and granular, coated with a fine white dust that rubs off on your fingers and leaves them feeling dry and slightly chalky. Along one edge, you can see the dark, bristly remnants of hair that were not fully removed by the lime, and there are a few small, hard nodules of cartilage or dried flesh that cling stubbornly to the inner surface. These must be scraped away before the hide goes into the vat, not because they would ruin the glue, but because they would add unnecessary impurities to the broth and make the later skimming more laborious. You carry the hide across the shed to a sturdy wooden beam that stands upright near the wall, a beam that you installed years ago specifically for this purpose. Its surface is worn smooth along one side from the repeated friction of hides being drawn across it, and a scattering of light, dry debris on the floor beneath it testifies to the many mornings of scraping that have taken place here. You drape the hide over the beam, arranging it so that the roughest section hangs down in front of you at a comfortable working height. Then you take up the scraping tool from its hook on the wall. The scraper is a simple implement, a flat blade of iron set into a short wooden handle, its edge kept sharp, but not so sharp that it would cut into the hide itself. You grip the handle with both hands and apply the blade to the surface of the hide, pressing down with a firm but gentle pressure and drawing it downward in a long, smooth stroke. The blade bites into the chalky residue and the bits of hair and dried tissue, peeling them away from the hide in a thin, curling ribbon that drops to the floor with a soft, dry rustle. The sound of the scraper on the hide is a low, rasping whisper, a noise that is neither harsh nor unpleasant, but simply the sound of work being done. And you repeat the stroke again and again, each pass removing a little more of the unwanted matter and revealing the cleaner, smoother surface beneath. The hide begins to change under your hands as you work. The chalky white residue gives way to a darker, more uniform surface, the color of weathered leather, and the rough, bristly patches disappear, leaving only the smooth, supple texture of the cured skin itself. You turn the hide over and scrape the other side more briefly, removing a few stray bits of lime that have been pressed into the folds, and then you run your hand over the entire surface to check for any remaining impurities. The hide feels cooler and smoother now, its surface slightly tacky to the touch, and it exudes a clean, animal smell that is different from the smell of the simmering vat, fresher and sharper, like the smell of a leather workshop on a dry day. Satisfied with the scraping, you fold the hide loosely over your arm and carry it to the side of the vat. Adding a hide to the simmering broth is a careful process, not because it is difficult, but because the hide is large and unwieldy and the liquid is hot. You stand beside the vat, the steam rising around you in a soft opalescent curtain, and you unfold the hide slowly, letting it hang from your hands like a heavy, flexible sheet. The heat from the vat warms your face and arms, and the smell of the simmering hooves rises up to meet the fresh, leathery scent of the hide, the two odors mingling in the air between you and the copper rim. You lower one edge of the hide into the liquid, watching as the hot broth soaks into the stiff fibers and the hide begins to soften immediately, its rigid structure relaxing and growing limp. You feed the hide into the vat gradually, hand over hand, letting it slide into the simmering liquid with a slow, deliberate motion that does not splash or disturb the surface more than necessary. The hide folds and crumples as it enters the water, its folds opening and closing like the pages of a heavy book, and then it sinks slowly, settling onto the mass of hooves at the bottom of the vat with a soft, heavy finality. You return to the pile and lift the next hide, carrying it to the scraping beam and repeating the same careful sequence of movements. The scraper rasps over the surface, the white dust falls, the hide grows cleaner and smoother, and then it too is carried to the vat and lowered into the steaming broth. Each hide behaves a little differently as it enters the water. Some are stiffer and take a moment longer to soften, their edges curling upward before they relent and sink. Others are more pliable from the start, folding into the liquid with a gentle willing motion. But all of them eventually settle into the vat, the hot water closing over them and beginning its slow work of extraction, the collagen within the hides starting the long process of dissolving into the broth. As you add hide after hide, the character of the vat begins to change. The volume of the liquid, which had seemed so ample with only the hooves inside, now rises perceptibly with each new addition, the displaced water climbing up the inner copper wall until it is nearly at the rim. You note this and adjust the fire slightly, closing the draft slide by a small amount so that the simmer remains gentle and does not slop over the edge. The color of the broth, which was a clear, pale amber after the first skimming, now deepens and clouds slightly as the hides release their own proteins and the last traces of lime dissolve into the liquid. The surface takes on a richer, more opaque quality, shifting from translucent to a soft, milky brown, and the foam that had been cleared away begins to reappear, this time a little darker and heavier, carrying the flavors and impurities of the hides. The smell of the shed deepens further as the hides begin to cook. The warm, horny scent of the hooves is now joined by a fuller, more complex leathery aroma, a smell that is at once animal and mineral, with a faint, distant hint of the tannery where the hides might have been processed if they had not been sent to you instead. This new smell rises with the steam and fills the entire shed, pressing against the walls and the roof, seeping into the grain of the wooden stool and the folds of your coat. It is a smell that would be overwhelming in a smaller space, but here in the open shed with the door and shutters letting in the fresh air from the yard, it is simply a strong, present note, a marker of the work that is being done. You breathe it in and out, your body long accustomed to the atmosphere, and you continue the steady, methodical rhythm of scraping and adding, scraping and adding. With each hide that goes into the vat, the broth grows a little thicker and a little richer. The hooves at the bottom have been simmering for hours and have already given up much of their soluble material, but the hides are still fresh and full of potential. Their dense, fibrous structure holding a wealth of collagen that will slowly dissolve into the liquid and give the final glue its strength and tackiness. The transformation that you are witnessing is invisible to the eye, but palpable in the changing texture of the broth, which now clings slightly to the skimmer when you lift it clear and leaves a faint, tacky residue on your fingers if you touch it. The liquid is no longer water, but a thin, weak glue, a glue that will grow stronger as the day progresses and the simmer does its patient work. When the last hide has been scraped and added to the vat, you take a moment to wipe your hands on the cloth at your belt and to survey the shed. The pile of hides is gone, replaced now by the loaded vat and the rising steam, and the scraping beam stands with a fresh layer of white dust at its base, a dust that you will sweep up later, along with the other debris of the day. The skimmer rests against the brick ledge, its blade still bearing the faint, oily sheen of the first foam, and the bucket of impurities sits near the door, waiting for its eventual journey to the garden. The fire murmurs quietly, its bed of coals glowing a steady, deep orange, and the copper vat ticks and pings as it expands and contracts with the heat. Everything is in order, and the shed has taken on the settled, contented air of a space that is fully engaged in its work. You walk to the firebox and add a few more lumps of coal, placing them carefully on the glowing bed and watching as they catch with a pale blue flicker. The fire will need to burn steadily for many more hours, maintaining the gentle simmer that is neither too hot nor too cool, and you adjust the draft slide to a position that you know from experience will hold the temperature exactly where it needs to be. Then you return to the stool and sit down, your body settling into the familiar worn hollows of the wood, your hands resting loosely on your thighs. The steam rises in a steady column, thick and white, carrying up the mingled smells of horn and hide and copper, and the surface of the broth rolls with a lazy, circular motion that speaks of the slow, ongoing transformation inside the vat. The day has now moved into its long, quiet middle, and there is nothing to do but wait, watch, and occasionally skim, letting the heat and the water and the patient, unhurried hours do their work. The morning skimming has left the surface of the liquor clean and clear, a glossy disc of pale amber that rolls gently with the simmer's steady, unhurried motion. You have returned the skimmer to its pegs and emptied the bucket of grey foam onto the garden behind the shed. the froth spreading across the dark earth in a thin, melting layer that will soon be indistinguishable from the soil. Now, as the sun climbs toward its highest point and the light through the open shutters shifts from slanted gold to a more direct, paler brightness, you turn your attention to the next task in the day's long, quiet sequence. This is the time for stirring, the midday rhythm of the paddle that helps the simmer do its work by keeping the contents of the vat in gentle, continuous motion. On the wall beside the skimmer, resting against the wooden boards and held in place by a simple iron bracket, is the paddle. You walk over and lift it from its resting place, feeling the familiar heft of the smooth ash handle and the slight forward weight of the broad wooden blade. The paddle is a tool of considerable age, older perhaps than the shed itself, and it bears the marks of its long service in every fiber of its grain. The handle is a single piece of ash, straight and true, its surface polished to a soft satiny sheen by the friction of countless hands over countless batches. Where the handle meets the blade, there is a carved shoulder, a gentle swelling of the wood that fits naturally into the curve of your palm. And below this, the blade flares outward into a flat, oval shape with rounded edges. The blade is made of beech, a wood that resists warping in hot liquid and does not impart any taste or color to the broth. It has darkened over the years from a pale, honeyed cream to a deep, rich brown, the color of strong tea left too long in the pot, and the grain lines are visible as faint, parallel streaks that run the length of the blade and curl around its edges. The front face of the blade is worn slightly concave from pushing against the heavy liquid, a shallow hollow that catches the light when you turn it, and the tip is rounded and smooth, without splinters or rough patches. You run your hand over the surface before you begin, a brief automatic check for any crack or looseness, and finding none, you carry the paddle to the side of the vat. Standing beside the copper cauldron, you position yourself so that the firebox is at your back and the open shutters are to your right, the light falling over your shoulder and onto the surface of the simmering liquor. The vat is full now, not just of the original water and hooves, but also of the hides that you added earlier in the morning, and the volume of liquid has risen until it sits perhaps 6 inches below the copper rim. The surface moves with the gentle, ubiquitous simmer, a soft rolling undulation that is almost hypnotic to watch, and the steam rises in a steady, unbroken column that smells deeply of the transformation taking place within. You grip the paddle with both hands, your right hand near the top of the handle and your left a little lower down, and you lower the blade slowly into the vat, sliding it edge first through the surface and down into the warm, thick liquid, until the blade is fully submerged and the handle rests against the copper rim. The first stir is always a careful, exploratory motion. You push the paddle forward gently, the broad face of the blade meeting the resistance of the liquid with a soft, muted pressure that travels up the handle and into your hands. The liquor at this stage of the day is still relatively thin, a watery broth that has not yet begun to thicken into true glue, but it is denser than plain water, carrying within it the dissolved proteins and gelatins that the simmer has extracted from the hooves. The paddle moves through it with a low, whispering sound, a sound that is more felt than heard, a deep, liquid sigh that seems to come from somewhere far below the surface. As you push, the liquid parts before the blade and then closes behind it, leaving a faint, swirling trail that marks the path of the stir. The motion is slow, deliberate, a smooth, unbroken arc that carries the paddle from the near side of the vat toward the center and then outward again, your arms moving with the steady, mechanical grace of long practice. You do not count your strokes aloud, but somewhere in the back of your mind a quiet tally is kept, a silent, automatic numbering that helps you maintain the rhythm. 1 stroke, 2 strokes, 3 strokes, each one a complete circuit of the vat, a full push from one side to the other and back again. The motion is not a rapid churning, but a slow, patient stirring, the blade moving at a pace that does not disturb the simmer or break the surface into ripples, but simply encourages the liquid to keep moving, to keep circulating, so that the heat is evenly distributed and the dissolving mass of hooves and hides does not settle into a stagnant lump at the bottom. You picture the interior of the vat as you stir, the submerged pile of materials resting on the copper floor, the hot water flowing through every crevice and hollow, the paddle's gentle pressure shifting the hooves and hides a little with each pass so that fresh surfaces are exposed to the heat and the extraction continues evenly. The sound of the stirring is a soft, liquid murmur that blends with the other sounds of the shed, the steady hum of the fire, the gentle bubbling of the simmer, the distant drip of the pump outside. Your own breathing falls into the rhythm of the paddle, slow and even, and the warmth of the steam wraps around your face and hands, while the heat from the firebox warms your back, a comfortable, encompassing heat that makes the shed feel like a small, self-contained world. The light catches the steam and fills the air with a soft, golden haze that turns the far corners of the shed into vague, indistinct shadows. And through the haze, you can see the familiar shapes of your tools hanging on the walls, the buckets stacked by the door, the pile of remaining hides waiting their turn. Everything is in its place. Everything is as it should be, and the stirring continues, stroke after stroke, a quiet, unwavering rhythm that measures out the midday hour. As you stir, you notice the subtle changes that have taken place in the liquor since the morning. The color has deepened further, moving from the pale amber of the early simmer to a richer, warmer brown, the color of polished walnut or the dark honey that comes from the heather moors. The transparency has changed as well. The liquid is no longer clear, but has taken on a slight, silky opacity, a soft, milky quality that speaks of the dissolved gelatin now beginning to thicken the broth. When you lift the paddle briefly from the vat and hold it above the surface, the liquor runs off the blade in slow, heavy sheets rather than quick, thin drips, and the drops that fall back into the vat land with a deeper, more resonant plop, the sound of a thicker liquid returning to its source. This is a good sign, a sign that the batch is progressing well, and you note it with a quiet, internal satisfaction that does not rise to the level of emotion, but is simply a recognition of things proceeding as they should. You return the paddle to the vat and resume the stirring, your arms settling back into the familiar motion without any conscious decision. The resistance of the liquid has increased slightly since you began, a subtle thickening that you can feel as a greater pressure against the blade, a slight additional weight that requires a little more strength to push through. This too is a good sign, an indication that the collagen from the hooves is continuing to dissolve and that the liquor is slowly transforming from a wheat broth into a strong, adhesive solution. You adjust your grip almost imperceptibly, your hands sliding a fraction of an inch up the handle to give you better leverage, and you continue the steady circular stirring with the same unhurried pace as before. The stirring is not a continuous unbroken motion, but a series of long, slow sessions punctuated by brief pauses. After every few dozen strokes you stop, lifting the paddle clear of the surface and resting its handle against the copper rim while you step back and let the liquid settle. During these pauses you check the fire, adding a lump of coal or adjusting the draft, and you walk once around the vat to look at the surface from different angles, checking for any sign of scorching or sticking on the bottom. The copper is an excellent conductor of heat, and if the fire is too fierce or the stirring too infrequent, the broth can catch and burn, leaving a dark, bitter residue that will ruin the color and smell of the glue. But today the fire is steady and moderate, the simmer gentle, and the bottom of the vat shows no sign of trouble. The liquor swirls slowly as it settles, the currents you have set in motion continuing to move the liquid for many minutes after you have stopped stirring, a slow, lazy rotation that gradually slows and then stills, leaving the surface as flat and glossy as a sheet of polished amber. During one of these pauses, you walk to the water barrel and dip a tin cup into the cool, clean water, drinking it slowly while you stand by the open door and look out at the yard. The day outside is warm and still, the sun high and the shadows short, the hedge of hawthorn a dark, motionless line against the pale blue sky. A few small clouds drift slowly overhead, their shapes soft and indistinct, and somewhere in the distance a cart rattles along the road to the market town, a faint, transient sound that comes and goes and leaves the silence deeper than before. You finish the water, refill the cup, and carry it back to the stool, setting it on the brick ledge where it will stay cool until you need it again. The stirring resumes, and with it the quiet, hypnotic rhythm of the paddle. You've now been stirring for perhaps an hour, though time in the shed is always difficult to measure, the minutes stretching and blending into one another until the passage of the day is marked not by the clock, but by the gradual changes in the vat. The liquor continues to deepen in color and thicken in consistency, and the smell of the simmer has evolved as well, losing the sharp, horny note of the early morning and taking on a richer, more mellow fragrance, a warm, savory scent that reminds you of slow-cooked broths and long, patient reductions. This is the smell of glue in the making, a smell that is unique to this shed and this fat and this particular combination of hooves and hides, a smell that you have known for so many years that it has become as familiar and unremarkable as the smell of your own skin. Your arms move in their steady circular pattern, the paddle tracing its same slow path through the liquid again and again, and your mind drifts into a state of calm, quiet attention that is neither focused nor distracted, but somewhere in between. You notice the small details of the stirring, the way the light plays on the surface of the liquor when the paddle breaks it into gentle, swirling patterns, the way the steam curls around the handle and condenses in tiny, glistening droplets on the wood, the way the fire murmurs its low, constant song beneath everything. You notice the feel of the earth floor under your boots, the slight unevenness where the ground has been worn down by years of standing in this exact spot, and you notice the weight of the paddle in your hands, a weight that has become so familiar that it feels less like a tool and more like an extension of your own body. As the stirring continues, you make small adjustments to your technique, variations that are so subtle they are almost unconscious. Sometimes you stir in a wide, slow circle that moves the entire volume of the vat, and sometimes you stir in a tighter pattern that concentrates on the center where the heat is most intense. Sometimes you push the paddle deep down to the bottom, scraping it gently along the copper floor to make sure that nothing is sticking, and sometimes you hold it just beneath the surface, agitating the upper layers of the liquor to encourage the last of the foam to rise. These variations are not planned or deliberate, but arise naturally from your long experience, a quiet, automatic response to the changing feel of the liquid and the subtle signals that the vat sends up through the handle of the paddle. The hides that you added earlier are now fully submerged and have begun to soften in the heat, their stiff, leathery folds relaxing and spreading out through the liquid. You can feel them occasionally as the paddle brushes against something larger and more solid than the hooves, a soft, giving resistance that yields and then moves aside, a reminder that the vat contains not just liquid, but a complex three-dimensional mass of materials that are slowly, patiently dissolving into something new. You stir around these obstacles without disturbing them, the paddle finding its way through the submerged landscape with a gentle automatic care that avoids tearing or breaking the hides before their time. The midday hour comes and goes without any marker, except a slight change in the angle of the light through the shutters. You pause to eat a piece of bread and a small wedge of cheese that you brought from the town, sitting on the stool with the food in your hand and the paddle leaning against the vat beside you. The bread is coarse and chewy, the cheese sharp and crumbly, and you eat them slowly while you watch the simmer and listen to the quiet sounds of the shed, the fire's soft murmur, and the gentle bubbling of the vat and the distant, intermittent calls of birds in the hedge. This is the only meal you will take until the evening, and you savor it without hurry, letting the flavors fill your mouth while the steam drifts around you, and the paddle waits patiently for your return. When you have finished eating, you wipe your hands on the cloth at your belt and take up the paddle once more. The rest has been brief, but it has been enough, and your arms feel refreshed and ready for the long afternoon of stirring that still lies ahead. You lower the blade into the vat and begin again, the rhythm re-establishing itself almost instantly, the paddle moving through the thick, warm liquor with a soft liquid sigh. The color of the broth is now a deep, translucent brown, the color of strong, well-brewed tea, and the consistency has thickened noticeably since the morning, the liquid clinging to the paddle in a slow, syrupy sheet that takes several seconds to drain away. The smell is rich and deep, a warm, savory odor that fills the shed and seeps out through the open shutters, and the steam rises in a thick, steady column that condenses on the roof beams and drips back down in slow, infrequent drops. The stirring continues through the early afternoon, the paddle tracing its same slow circles while the light shifts and the shadows lengthen, and the world outside the shed moves on without you. You stir and pause, the rhythm as steady as a heartbeat, and the vat responds to your patient attention by giving up more and more of its hooves and hides, the liquor deepening and thickening and moving slowly, imperceptibly, toward the moment when it will be ready to strain. That moment is still a long way off, many hours of simmer and stir ahead, but the work of the midday paddle has done its part, and the batch is well on its way to becoming glue. The afternoon arrives in the shed without announcement, slipping in through the open shutters and the gap beneath the door, a slow golden presence that replaces the pale, watery light of morning with something richer and heavier. The sun has climbed past its highest point and now hangs in a sky that is pale blue and cloudless. A quiet, late summer sky that promises many more hours of warmth before the evening cools it away. Its light enters the shed at a slant, angling downward through the windows and falling across the packed earth floor in long, soft rectangles that shift by imperceptible degrees as the minutes pass. Where the light strikes the rising steam, the vapor glows with a soft internal luminescence, turning from a grayish-white to a warm, buttery gold, and the whole interior of the shed takes on the muted, honeyed quality of an old painting. You are sitting on the low wooden stool, your back resting against the rough surface of the wall, your hands folded loosely in your lap. The stool has been your perch for hours now, and its shape has grown familiar in a way that goes beyond mere comfort, its worn hollows fitting the contours of your body as if it had been made for you alone. The heat from the vat washes over you in a steady, gentle wave, and you have loosened the top button of your shirt and pushed your sleeves up past your wrists, your forearms bare and warm in the still air. There is no urgency in your posture, no sense that you ought to be doing something else, because the work of the afternoon is not a work of action, but a work of attention. A slow, patient watching that is as much a part of the boiling as the skimming or the stirring. The liquid in the vat has now been simmering for many hours, and its color has deepened steadily throughout the day, moving from the pale, milky amber of the morning through a series of richer, darker shades, until it has arrived at a deep, translucent brown. It is the color of strong tea that has been steeped for a long time, a color that holds the light within itself and seems to glow faintly from within. When you rise from the stool and look down into the vat, you can see into the liquid for a small distance, the submerged hooves and hides visible as darker, indistinct shapes that shift slightly with the motion of the simmer, their edges softened and blurred by the density of the broth. The hooves have been reduced by the heat, their hard, horny exteriors worn away and their inner structures beginning to collapse, while the hides have become limp and gel-like, their fibers loosening and releasing the last of their stored collagen into the surrounding liquid. The broth itself has taken on a slight syrupy quality, a thickness that is not yet the full tackiness of finished glue, but a promise of it, a weight that clings to the stirring paddle when you lift it clear. The foam that rises to the surface now is different from the foam of the morning. Then it was pale and abundant, a continuous layer of grayish froth that needed frequent skimming. Now the foam appears only in small isolated clusters, darker in color and denser in texture, a scattering of tan-colored patches that drift slowly across the surface and gather near the edges where the convection current is weakest. The smell that rises with the steam is deeper too, less sharp and more mellow, a rich, rounded, earthy smell that has lost the raw animal edge it had in the early hours and taken on something almost nutty, almost sweet, a fragrance that speaks of slow cooking and complete transformation. The foam patches sit on the surface like small, irregular islands, and you skim them with long, slow passes of the iron blade, the work now so gentle and unhurried that it feels less like labor and more like a quiet, absent-minded ritual. The skimmer moving through the liquid with barely a whisper. The long pauses between skim passes have grown longer as the afternoon has progressed. Where before you skimmed every few minutes, now you wait for 10 or 15 minutes at a stretch, watching the surface of the vat with calm, patient eyes, noting the slow drift of the remaining foam and the gentle, rolling motion of the simmer. During these intervals, you sit on the stool and let your mind wander without direction, your thoughts drifting through the quiet, sunlit air of the shed like the motes of dust that hang in the slanted light. You think of nothing in particular, or of small, unimportant things. The leak in the water barrel that you will need to patch next week, the supply of coal in the lean-to that will last another month at the current rate, the taste of the bread and cheese that you will eat when the midday hunger finally prompts you to rise. These thoughts come and go without urgency, each one arriving, lingering for a while, and then fading away, replaced by a new thought or by the simple, pleasant absence of thought. At some point, without making a conscious decision, you rise from the stool and walk to the small shelf near the door where you keep your midday meal. The shelf is a simple plank of wood held up by 2 iron brackets, and on it rests a cloth bundle folded around a piece of bread and a small wedge of hard cheese. Beside the bundle sits a tin cup, its surface dented and mottled with age, and next to the cup is a clay jug of water that you filled from the pump earlier in the day. You untie the cloth and lay it flat on the shelf, revealing the bread and cheese, and then you pour water from the jug into the tin cup, the liquid gurgling softly and catching the golden light in its clear depths. You carry the bread, the cheese, and the cup back to the stool, arranging them on your lap with the cloth spread out to catch any crumbs, and you begin to eat. The bread is a day old, its crust firm and chewy, its interior soft and slightly dense. It is a simple brown bread made from the coarse flour that is sold at the market on Saturdays, and it tastes faintly of wheat and yeast and the wood smoke from the baker's oven. The cheese is a hard pale yellow wedge with a sharp salty tang that lingers on your tongue, and you break off small pieces and eat them slowly, alternating bites of cheese with bites of bread. The water in the tin cup is cool and clean, tasting faintly of the iron from the pump and the deep mineral earth from which it was drawn, and you drink it in small, measured sips, letting each mouthful wash away the dryness of the bread and the salt of the cheese. You eat without hurry, your jaw moving in a slow, steady rhythm, your eyes wandering across the interior of the shed and coming to rest on the shifting patterns of the steam or the steady, glowing heart of the firebox. The meal is a quiet, solitary pause in a day that is itself quiet and solitary, and you take your time with it, knowing that there is no reason to rush. The vat will continue its slow simmer, whether you are eating or skimming or simply sitting, and the fire will burn for many more hours on the coal you have already added. When the last bite of bread is finished and the last sip of water swallowed, you fold the cloth and set it back on the shelf, leaving the cup beside it, and you return to the stool, settling into its familiar shape with a quiet, contented sigh that is barely more than a breath. The light continues to shift as the afternoon draws on, the slanting rays moving slowly across the floor and climbing the opposite wall, their color changing from bright gold to a deeper, more amber tone. The steam, caught in these rays, glows with a soft, layered radiance, and the shadows in the corners of the shed deepen and grow, taking on a velvety, restful quality. The temperature in the shed has reached a steady, even warmth, a warmth that is neither too hot nor too cool, but exactly comfortable, a warmth that seems to hold you in a gentle, supportive embrace. Your eyelids grow heavy from time to time, and you let them close for a few moments, the darkness behind them a pleasant contrast to the golden light, the sounds of the shed washing over you in a soft, continuous murmur that is deeply soothing. The simmering vat produces a sound that is now so familiar that you have stopped hearing it as a distinct noise. It is a low, liquid gurgling sound, a sound of gentle, constant motion, the bubbles rising in a steady stream and breaking at the surface with a faint, wet plip that repeats itself over and over in no particular pattern. The fire beneath contributes its own steady, murmuring undertone, the hiss of the draught and the occasional soft collapse of a coal shifting in the grate. And together these sounds create a kind of quiet music, a music without melody or rhythm, but with a deep, comforting presence that fills the shed and pushes back the silence. The pump outside, which seemed so loud in the early morning, is now merely a distant, intermittent punctuation, a single drip every few seconds that marks time without urgency. From time to time, you rise to attend to the small tasks that the afternoon requires. You walk to the firebox and peer through the vent, noting the state of the coals, which still glow with a satisfactory, deep orange heat. You take a lump of coal from the bucket and place it on the bed, watching the pale blue flame appear, and then fade as the coal catches, and then you adjust the draft slide a fraction of an inch, opening it slightly to compensate for the afternoon breeze that has just begun to stir outside. The breeze enters through the open shutters, a faint, cool thread of air that is perceptible against the warmth of the shed, and it carries with it the scent of dry grass and distant wildflowers, a clean outdoor fragrance that briefly mingles with the deep, earthy smell of the vat before being swallowed by it. The breeze is a small reminder of the world beyond the shed, a world that continues its own slow rhythms while you tend the simmering broth. You also check the surface of the vat during these small excursions, your eyes scanning for the dark patches of foam that signal the need for another skim. When a patch is gathered, you take up the skimmer and draw it slowly across the surface, collecting the dark froth and depositing it in the bucket with a soft, heavy plop. The foam now is sparse enough that a single pass is often sufficient to clear the entire surface, and you return the skimmer to its resting place and go back to the stool, the whole task taking no more than a minute. The broth beneath the cleared surface shines with a dark, glassy luster, its color a deep, translucent brown that seems to deepen further as the afternoon light begins its slow shift toward evening. The deep color of the broth is a sign that the extraction is proceeding well, that the hooves and hides have given up nearly all of their soluble material, and that the liquor is now rich with collagen and gelatin and all the other substances that will, when cooled and strained, become the finished glue. You know from long experience that the color is a reliable guide, that a pale broth is a weak broth, and that this deep, translucent brown is exactly what you hope to see at this stage of the boil. The color will deepen a little more before the day is over, taking on the faintest hint of reddish mahogany, but for now it is just right, and you feel a quiet, wordless satisfaction that is too mild to be called pride, but too genuine to be dismissed. The afternoon stretches on in this way, a long, slow progression of small, repeated actions and longer intervals of stillness. You sit, you watch, you skim, you feed the fire, you sit again. The golden light grows richer and then begins to soften, the sharp, angled rays of midday giving way to the more diffuse, honeyed glow of late afternoon. The shadows lengthen and merge, the corners of the shed growing dimmer and more mysterious, and the steam, which was so luminous an hour ago, now begins to fade back to a soft, grayish white as the light withdraws. The smell of the shed, which had reached its peak intensity around midday, now seems to mellow slightly, settling into a deep, steady, restful fragrance that is as much a part of the space as the walls and the roof. You feel the afternoon's slow passage in your own body, in the slight stiffness in your shoulders when you rise from the stool, in the comfortable fullness of your belly from the bread and cheese, in the heavy, drowsy warmth that has settled into your limbs. You are not tired exactly, but you are deeply relaxed, your body and mind moving in the same slow, steady rhythm as the simmering vat, a rhythm that asks nothing more than your quiet, undemanding presence. The work of the afternoon is nearly done, and soon the light will begin its final fading, and the time for straining and cooling will arrive. But for now, you simply sit and watch the gentle bubbling of the brew, letting the slow golden minutes pass one by one, each one as quiet and unhurried as the last. The late afternoon has brought the liquor to the point of readiness, and something in the smell of the shed, something in the way the steam rises a little more slowly now and hangs in the air a little longer before fading, tells you that the long simmer has done its work. The color of the broth, which you have watched deepen all day through its patient progression of ambers and browns, has now reached a shade that is almost complete, a deep, translucent mahogany that holds the slanting light within itself and glows with a quiet, internal richness. When you lift the paddle clear of the surface, the liquid runs off the blade in a slow, syrupy curtain that takes several seconds to thin and break, the final drops falling back into the vat with a heavy, reluctant plop that speaks of the thickness the broth has now achieved. The hooves of the bottom have been reduced to soft, crumbling shapes, and the hides have loosened into limp, gelatinous masses that have given up nearly all of their stored collagen. The time has come to separate the valuable liquid from the spent solids, to strain the first thin liquor from the vat and set it aside to cool. The straining apparatus waits in the corner of the shed, where it always waits, leaning against the wall with the patient, unassuming readiness of a thing that is used only once in each cycle of work, but is essential to the whole. It consists of two parts, a sturdy wooden frame and a length of coarse linen cloth. You walk over and lift the frame first, carrying it to the center of the shed and setting it down on the packed earth floor with care, the joints creaking softly as they take the weight. The frame is a simple rectangle of beechwood, its corners joined with peg mortises that have held firm for many years, its inner edges chamfered to a smooth, rounded profile. Across the top of the frame, two crossbars provide a resting place for the straining cloth, and four short legs lift the whole structure, perhaps 18 inches above the ground. You position the frame carefully so that it sits level, testing it by pressing down on each corner in turn and feeling for any wobble, any unevenness in the floor that might cause the frame to tilt. The earth is hard and flat beneath it, worn smooth by the same work that you were about to perform, and the frame settles into its place with a solid, grounded steadiness. Next, you take the straining cloth from its shelf, unfolding it slowly and shaking out the folds with a soft, snapping motion that sends a faint puff of fine, white dust into the golden air. The cloth is a square of coarse linen, its weave open enough to let the thin liquor through, but tight enough to catch the smallest particles of undissolved hoof and hide. It has been used many times and washed many times, and its surface has taken on a permanent, faintly amber stain from the countless batches of blue that have passed through its fibers. The edges of the cloth are hemmed with a sturdy double row of stitching, and at each corner a short loop of cord has been sewn into the hem. You drape the cloth over the frame, spreading it across the crossbars and letting it hang down in a shallow, sling-like depression that will hold the hot liquid as it strains. You secure each corner loop over a small wooden peg that projects from the frame, and when all four corners are fixed, you run your hand gently across the surface of the cloth, smoothing out any wrinkles and making sure that the weave is open and unobstructed. A final, careful check that everything is ready. Now you position the receiving tub. This is a smaller vessel than the main vat, an oaken half-barrel that you have fitted with rope handles and a tight, well-made lid. It sits on a low wooden trolley with small iron wheels that squeak faintly when you move it, and you roll it across the floor and position it directly beneath the straining frame so that the cloth hangs just above its open mouth. The tub is clean and dry, its interior smelling faintly of the previous batch, a mild, savory scent that is almost pleasant, and you check its volume with a quick glance, confirming that it has room for all the liquid you will pour. Beside the receiving tub you place a second, smaller bucket for the residue, the spent bits of hoof and hide that will be caught by the cloth and later spread on the fields. Everything is arranged now in a neat, functional geometry that centers on the straining frame, and the shed takes on the quiet, expectant stillness of a space prepared for the final, culminating task of the day. You walk to the main vat and take up the long-handled copper ladle from its hook beside the firebox. The ladle is a deep, bowl-shaped scoop with a pouring lip formed into one side and a long ash handle that keeps your hands well away from the hot liquid. Its copper surface is dark with age and use, mottled with the gentle greenish patina that forms on copper that has been in contact with organic matter for many years. You carry the ladle to the vat and dip it slowly into the simmering broth, the bowl sinking through the surface with a soft, liquid sound and filling with the hot, amber-colored liquor. The weight of the full ladle is substantial but manageable, a heavy, steady pull that you brace with both hands, and you lift it clear of the vat with care, not spilling a drop, the surface of the liquid quivering slightly within the bowl but holding its place. The steam rises from the ladle in a thin, curling ribbon, and the smell of the broth, now concentrated in the smaller volume, fills your nostrils with its rich, deep fragrance. You carry the full ladle across the short distance to the straining frame, your boots making their soft, familiar tread on the earth floor, and you pause beside the cloth, holding the ladle steady. Then you tip it slowly, pouring the hot liquid onto the center of the straining cloth in a thin, controlled stream. The liquor hits the linen with a soft, hissing sound and spreads outward in a dark, glistening circle, its heat making the cloth steam gently. For a moment, the liquid pools on the surface, held by the tight weave, and then it begins to pass through, the first drops appearing on the underside of the cloth and falling into the receiving tub with a quiet, musical plink. More drops follow, and then a thin, steady stream, the liquid filtering through the cloth and leaving behind the fine, granular residue that was suspended within. The sound of the straining is a soft, intermittent patter, a sound like the first few drops of rain on a still pond, and beneath it, you can hear the faint, almost subaudible hiss of the hot liquid meeting the cooler wood of the tub. You return to the vat and dip the ladle again, filling it and carrying it back to the frame, pouring another slow, steady stream onto the cloth. The process repeats, each trip a measured, unhurried journey across the shed, each pour a careful, controlled motion that does not splash or spill. The receiving tub slowly fills, the level of strained liquor rising in small incremental stages, and as it rises, the sound of the dripping changes, the drops falling into existing liquid with a softer, deeper note that gradually replaces the bright, ringing plink of the first drops. The strained liquid in the tub is a clear, golden brown, free of the cloudiness and particles that were visible in the unfiltered broth, and its surface is smooth and glassy, reflecting the light from the shutters in a single, unbroken sheen. The straining cloth, in contrast, begins to accumulate a layer of residue, the fine, granular matter that was suspended in the broth. The tiny fragments of dissolved hoof and the microscopic fibers of hide are caught by the linen and held on its surface, forming a thin, dark, muddy film that spreads and thickens with each new pour. This residue is the last of the impurities, the final solid matter that must be removed before the glue can be called finished, and its appearance is a sign that the straining is doing its work. As the layer builds, the flow of liquid through the cloth begins to slow, the pores of the linen becoming partially blocked by the accumulated matter, and you note this with patient acceptance, knowing that you will need to pause and scrape the cloth before continuing. When the flow has slowed to a thin, reluctant trickle, you set down the ladle and take up a flat wooden scraper that you keep for this exact purpose. The scraper is a simple paddle of smooth beechwood with a squared-off end, and you use it to gently lift the accumulated residue from the surface of the straining cloth, drawing it carefully toward the edge and then tipping it into the waiting bucket. The residue is a dark, gritty paste that smells strongly of the simmered hooves and hides, a dense, concentrated version of the odor that has filled the shed all day, and it comes away from the cloth in soft, moist clumps that drop into the bucket with a heavy, wet thud. You work the scraper across the cloth in slow, careful strokes, removing as much of the residue as you can without damaging the linen weave. And when you are done, the cloth is nearly clean again, its surface dark and damp, but its pores open and ready for the next round of straining. You return to the vat and continue the slow, rhythmic work of ladling and pouring, the ladle dipping and lifting, the liquor streaming through the cloth, the residue gradually building and being scraped away. The process stretches on through the late afternoon, the light in the shed continuing its slow golden fade, and you move through the sequence of actions with the calm, unhurried ease of a person who has done this many times and knows that there is no reason to rush. Each ladleful of broth is transferred with the same careful attention. Each pour is watched with the same quiet gaze, and each scraping of the cloth is performed with the same gentle, methodical care. The receiving tub fills steadily, the level of clear, strained liquor climbing toward the rim, and the main vat empties by corresponding degrees, its contents slowly diminishing, until the submerged shapes of the hooves and hides begin to emerge from the receding liquid, like dark, warm stones appearing as a lake is drained. When the vat is nearly empty, the last of the liquid lying in a shallow pool at the bottom among the exhausted hooves and hides, you change your approach slightly. Instead of dipping the ladle into the center of the vat, you work it carefully around the edges and into the crevices, gathering the final, precious liquor from where it is collected. These last ladlefuls are the thickest and richest of the entire batch, the liquid that has been in closest contact with the dissolving materials for the longest time, and they pour onto the straining cloth in a slow, syrupy stream that takes longer to filter through. You watch them with particular attention, noting the way the light catches the deep, dark color, the way the liquid clings to the ladle and the cloth, the way the final drops fall into the receiving tub, with a sound that is heavier and more resonant than the earlier, thinner broth. At last the vat is empty of liquid, only the spent, crumbling mass of hooves and hides remaining on the copper bottom. These remnants look nothing like the materials you loaded into the vat this morning, their hard, defined shapes reduced to a soft, amorphous residue that has given up all of its soluble substance to the water and the heat. They smell faintly of the broth, but also of something else, something exhausted and complete, the smell of a thing that has served its purpose and has nothing more to give. You will leave these solids in the vat for now, covering them with a little cold water to prevent them from drying and hardening overnight, and tomorrow you will lift them out and carry them to the compost heap, where they will slowly return to the earth. You turn your attention now to the receiving tub, which is full of the strained golden brown liquor. The liquid is still hot, its surface steaming gently, and it is perfectly clear, free of any cloudiness or sediment. You take a moment simply to look at it, to appreciate the color and clarity that represent the successful culmination of the long day's work, and then you lift the heavy, tight-fitting lid and place it over the tub, sealing the liquid inside so that it can cool slowly and without contamination. The lid settles into its groove with a soft, hollow thud, and the steam, cut off from the air, condenses on the underside of the wood and drips back into the liquor in a slow, invisible cycle. The tub will sit here in the shed overnight, the liquid gradually cooling and beginning to set into the firm, gelatinous mass that is the precursor to the final glue, a mass that you will cut into blocks and dry on racks in the coming days. For now, however, its work is done, and it needs only the quiet passage of the night hours to complete its transformation. You lift the straining cloth from the frame, shaking the last of the residue into the bucket, and then carrying the cloth outside to the pump, where you rinse it in a bucket of cold water, working the weave between your fingers to loosen any remaining particles. The cold water is a sharp, refreshing contrast to the warmth of the shed, and you stand for a moment in the cool, early evening air. The sky above you, a pale, fading blue with a single distant cloud hanging low on the horizon. The water runs off the cloth in thin brown rivulets and then gradually clears, and when the cloth is clean, you wring it out carefully and carry it back inside, hanging it over a beam to dry. The frame you wipe down with a damp rag and return to its corner, and the ladle and scraper are rinsed and hung back on their hooks. The straining is done, the first thin liquor is safely stored, and the shed, which has worked so steadily all day, begins its slow, quiet transition into evening. The work of the straining is done, and the receiving tub sits now in the quiet center of the shed, its lid firmly in place and its contents slowly beginning the long, patient process of cooling. The fire beneath the main vat, which has burned steadily since the early morning, has been allowed to die down at last, its work for the day complete. You have not added coal for some time, and the bed of embers that glowed so brightly through the afternoon has faded to a deep, pulsing crimson beneath a thin layer of fine, grey ash. The iron door of the firebox stands slightly ajar, and through the gap you can see the last, lingering coals, their surfaces dimming and brightening in a slow, rhythmic breath as the draught moves over them. They will continue to give off a gentle, diminishing warmth for another hour or two, and then they will cool entirely, leaving nothing but the soft, pale ash that you will sweep out in the morning when the new day begins. The copper vat, relieved of its liquid burden, now holds only the spent, exhausted mass of hooves and hides that lie in a dark, crumpled heap on the bottom. You have ladled a few buckets of cold water over these remains to cover them, preventing them from drying into a hard, stubborn crust overnight. The water sits in a shallow, still pool above the residue, its surface already cooling and losing the warmth it absorbed from the hot copper, and tomorrow you will lift the solids out with a fork and a shovel and carry them away to the compost heap in the corner of the field, where they will slowly moulder and return to the earth that once fed the animals they came from. For tonight they rest in their cold bath, silent and spent, their long transformation finished. The shed itself is beginning to cool as the fire dies and the evening air seeps in through the open shutters and the gap beneath the door. The thick, enveloping warmth that filled the space all afternoon is now thinning and softening, replaced by a cooler, fresher current that carries with it the first hints of the night to come. You can feel the change on your skin, a slight, pleasant chill where before there was only steady heat, and you welcome it as a sign that the day is truly winding down. The smell of the shed, too, has altered with the cooling. The dense, rich odor of the simmering broth, which reached its peak intensity in the late afternoon, is now fading into a milder, more diffuse fragrance, a blend of damp steam, cooling copper, wet ash, and the faint, lingering sweetness of the finished glue. It is the smell of completion, the smell of a task brought to its proper end, and it hangs in the air like a quiet, invisible benediction. You begin the final tasks of the day with the same unhurried, methodical pace that has governed every action since the morning. The cleaning of the tools is a ritual you perform at the end of each batch, a slow, careful process that ensures everything is ready for the next day's work and that nothing is left to rust or sour or attract vermin in the night. You start with the skimmer, lifting it from its resting place beside the vat and carrying it outside to the pump. The evening air is cool and still, the sky overhead a pale, washed blue that is just beginning to deepen toward dusk. A single star, faint and tentative, hangs low in the east, and the hedge of hawthorn is a dark, silent shape against the fading light. You work the pump handle with a slow, steady rhythm, the cold water gushing into the bucket with a sound that seems louder now than it did in the morning, the surrounding quiet amplifying each splash and gurgle. You dip the skimmer blade into the water and then scrub it gently with a stiff bristled brush, working the bristles into the perforations and around the iron rim, removing every trace of the grey foam and the dark, oily residue that accumulated during the day's skimming. The water in the bucket turns a cloudy brown and you empty it onto the ground beside the pump and refill it, repeating the process until the water runs clear and the iron blade is clean and bright, its surface gleaming with a faint, metallic sheen. You dry the skimmer blade with a rag and then carry it back into the shed, hanging it carefully on its two pegs with the blade facing outward so that any remaining moisture will evaporate overnight. Next, you take the stirring paddle, which still bears the sticky, syrupy traces of the broth on its wooden blade. The paddle requires a gentler cleaning because the wood can swell and crack if it is soaked too long. You wipe the blade first with a damp cloth, removing the bulk of the residue, and then you scrub it lightly with the brush and a small amount of water, working quickly and thoroughly until the beechwood is clean and smooth. The paddle's surface, worn concave by years of stirring, feels almost velvety under your fingers, and you run your hand along it one last time before hanging it back in its iron bracket, where it will rest until the next batch calls it into service. The ladle is next, its copper bowl still warm from the hot liquor it carried. You rinse it at the pump, the cold water hissing against the metal and sending up a brief, faint cloud of steam, and then you wipe it dry with the rag, buffing the copper until it glows with a soft, muted luster. The scraper, the measuring stick, the wire brush from the firebox, each tool in turn is cleaned and dried and returned to its proper place on the wall or the shelf. The buckets are rinsed and stacked, their iron bands dripping the last, cold drops of water onto the earth floor. The rag you have used hangs now from a nail by the door, dark and damp and smelling faintly of glue, and you note that it will need to be washed in the morning along with the straining cloth. That cloth, still hanging over the beam where you draped it earlier, has dried slightly in the cooling air. Its coarse weave stiff and crusty in places where the last traces of the glue have set. You will soak it tomorrow in a tub of cold water and then boil it clean, but for tonight it can stay where it is, a pale, ghostly rectangle in the dimming light. With the tools cleaned and the work surfaces wiped down, you turn your attention to the receiving tub. It sits in the middle of the shed like a quiet, patient presence, its wooden lid sealed firmly in place and its contents hidden from view. You kneel beside it and place your hand on the side of the oaken staves, feeling the warmth that still radiates from within. The heat is noticeable, but no longer hot, a gentle, living warmth that tells you the liquor is cooling slowly and evenly, exactly as it should. You lean close and listen, and you can hear very faintly the soft internal sounds of the cooling liquid, a quiet, ticking contraction as the volume reduces slightly with the falling temperature, a barely perceptible creak from the wooden staves as they adjust to the warmth and the weight. These are the sounds of a successful batch, the sounds of good blue settling into its rest, and you listen to them for a moment with a quiet, wordless satisfaction that needs no expression. You check the lid to make sure it is seated evenly in its groove, running your fingers around the rim to feel for any gaps or misalignments. The lid is tight and true, and the cloth gasket that you fitted around its edge last month is still sound, sealing the tub against dust and insects and the curious noses of the mice that live in the hedge. Satisfied, you rise from your kneeling position and brush the dust from your knees. A few pale, dry particles drifting down to join the other detritus of the day on the earth floor. The tub will remain here undisturbed through the night and into the next day, the liquor within slowly cooling and thickening, the long gelatin molecules forming their invisible bonds as the temperature drops, until by tomorrow afternoon the liquid will have set into a firm, quivering jelly that can be cut into blocks and laid out to dry. That work belongs to another day, however, and for now the tub needs only the quiet darkness of the shed and the slow, patient hours of the night. The light outside has continued to fade while you worked, the pale blue of the sky deepening to a soft, muted grey that is already darkening at the eastern edge. The golden rays that slanted through the shutters have disappeared entirely, replaced by a flat, even, colourless light that makes the interior of the shed seem larger and more shadowed than it did an hour ago. You walk to the first of the two windows and reach up to the shutter, taking hold of its edge and pulling it gently inward. The hinges, which you oiled earlier in the season with a drop of tallow from the vat, move without a sound, and the shutter swings closed, its iron hook dropping into its eye with a soft, metallic click. The light in the shed dims by a perceptible degree, the far corner where the hides were piled now lost in shadow. You walk to the second shutter and repeat the motion, the second click echoing the first, and now the shed is lit only by the faint residual glow from the dying fire and the thin grey light that seeps through the cracks between the weatherboards. The interior feels immediately more enclosed, more sheltered, a small private world that has drawn its boundaries close for the night. You pause for a moment in the dimness, letting your eyes adjust, and you look around the shed one final time. The shapes of your tools are just visible on the walls, dark outlines against the darker wood, each one in its proper place. The vat sits squat and silent on its brick bed, its copper surface now cool enough to touch, its interior a dark, empty cavity that smells faintly of the day's work. The firebox glows with a last faint orange breath, the coals now almost entirely covered by their blanket of ash, and even as you watch, the glow dims a little more, a coal collapsing softly into powder, with a sound that is barely a whisper. The receiving tub is a solid, patient bulk in the center of the floor, its presence reassuring and complete. Everything is as it should be. Everything is ready for the night, and you feel a quiet, deep sense of order settling over the space like a gentle, invisible snowfall. You walk to the door and stand in the open threshold for a moment, looking out at the yard. The evening has arrived fully now. The sky a deep, soft blue-grey with a few brighter patches where the last light lingers in the west. The hawthorn hedge is a solid, dark mass, its leaves still and silent in the windless air, and beyond it the field stretches away into the gathering dusk, a pale, indistinct expanse that merges with the sky at its far edge. The pump stands as a dark, angular silhouette against the fading light, and a single, last drip falls from its spout and lands in the bucket below with a soft, distant plink that seems to hang in the quiet air for a long moment before fading. The air smells of cool earth and dry grass and the faint, clean scent of the coming night, and it is a relief after the long, warm hours in the shed, a freshness that clears your lungs and lifts the fatigue of the day from your shoulders. You step back inside and take your coat from the hook by the door, shaking it out and pulling it on over your shoulders. The fabric is cool against your arms, and it smells faintly of the shed, of glue and smoke and steam, a smell that you will carry with you as you walk back to the town, and that will linger in the fabric until you air it out tomorrow. You check that the firebox door is closed securely, the draft slide pushed fully in so that no stray ember can escape, and you glance once more at the receiving tub, its lid still firmly in place, its warmth still gently radiating into the cooling air. Then you step through the doorway and into the yard, pulling the heavy door closed behind you with a soft, solid thud that shuts the shed up tight for the night. The latch drops into its groove with a familiar, final click, and you stand for a moment with your hand resting on the rough grain of the wood, feeling the day's work settle into the past. The shed is now a dark, silent shape behind you, its work done, its fire dying, its blue cooling in the quiet darkness, and you turn away from it and begin the slow walk back along the dirt path toward the market town. The path is pale in the dusk, a faint, winding ribbon that leads between the dark shapes of the hedgerows, and your boots make a soft, steady tread on the packed earth. The same tread they made this morning, when the day was new and the work had not yet begun. The cottages of the town are visible now as a cluster of warm yellow lights in the distance, their windows glowing with the soft, welcoming radiance of lamps and candles, and the smell of wood smoke from the evening fires drifts out to meet you, mixing with the cool, clean air of the fields. You walk slowly, without hurry, your body tired in a way that is pleasant and well-earned, your muscles loose and warm from the long hours of standing and stirring and skimming. Your mind is quiet, the thoughts of the day already fading into a soft, indistinct blur, and you notice the small, simple things along the path, the pale shape of an owl gliding silently over the field, the distant bark of a dog in the town, the way the first stars are beginning to appear in the darkening sky overhead. The evening is calm and still, and you move through it like a figure in a painting, a quiet, solitary shape making its way homeward after a day of patient, unhurried labor. By the time you reach the edge of the town and the first cottages close around you, the night has fully fallen, and the path behind you has disappeared into the darkness. The shed is now just a memory, a warm, dim space full of the smell of glue and the murmur of the fire, and it will wait there patiently through the night, holding the cooling tub and the spent vat and the clean tools in its quiet wooden embrace until you return in the morning to begin the work again. You walk the last few steps to your door, the familiar latch lifting under your hand, and you step inside, leaving the yard and the shed and the quiet sleeping fields to the darkness and the stars.